These are the slides that are missing on the narration for presentation number 9 about exegesis.
Here is the format that you will use for exegesis. First, you want to see, where does this come from? How many sources is it mentioned in? Does it come specifically just from the Markan source? In other words, from the traditions of Peter through his disciple Mark? Is it in Mark's Gospel and then also repeated in Luke's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel? Or is it something in Mark's Gospel that we find in some source like a Gospel of Thomas, even earlier than Mark's Gospel? Does it come from an even earlier source? Or is it from the Q source, that is, the common material that Matthew and Luke share, the sayings, notes that were kept by someone in perhaps the second generation? Is it a Q document? And you can go and check out what is in Q on some of the links that I've given you. You can look in the Jesus Seminar. You can look at, even search the internet, but I've given you links for you to see what are the characteristics of what Q would have been like as a document. What does it have in it? What does it contain? But is it in the Q material only, just the material that's shared by Luke and Matthew? Or is it in the special Matthean material only? Is it only appear in Matthew's Gospel? Or only in Luke's Gospel, the special Lucan material? Or is it just simply Johannine material, which is very much of it is quite different from all the others, has its own tradition, or from some other tradition like that, for example, of Thomas? Second, you want to look at what the Aramaic is of the Greek words, especially the certain special Greek words that are used that we know refer back to certain Aramaic words. You want to see what these are, and you want to make sure you're working with the right concepts when you work backwards, so you're going to use the materials that I've supplied and given you to do that. Now that you've decided where it comes from, which may determine how early it is or how late in the development of the early Gentile churches that it developed as a saying or as a parable, you want to identify what the probable historical teachings of Jesus were after removing the spin. You want to look at what kinds of issues are there here that are not issues at Jesus' times with Jesus. For example, we find anti-Semitic stuff. Jesus was not an anti-Semite. That might have been originally anti-temple establishment issue or something like that. And then you're going to check critically for what it might mean in the context of other authentic logia or mashlim or parables and so on that you've analyzed and looked at before, or a known context, some kind of a known context in Jewish mysticism that is the background out of which Yeshua taught, or certain other contemporary first century references, things like Jewish wedding institutions and things like that I've mentioned. And finally, what you want to do then is look for the major spiritual themes in the teachings as you find them and as you go through them yourself. Now, I have identified for you what I see in them. Other people will see different things, and you may find different things as well. But this is a search that you're doing. At least you're basing what you're doing with the Bible and with the New Testament on trying to recover the authentic historical teachings of the Master Jesus, rather than later doctrinal teachings of churches, and certainly rather than contemporary or medieval doctrinal teachings of churches, which Yeshua himself would have called the doctrines of men and not the laws of God. Now, our first exegetical example shows some very interesting things that I want to point out. The example is the parable of the feast. This is the feast where people are invited and they turn down the invitation, so he goes out and invites people from the byways and so on. Now, this is very interesting because this appears in the Gospel of Thomas, Logian 64, in Matthew's Gospel, and in Luke's Gospel. So if we were just doing biblical criticism without any access to the Gospel of Thomas, we'd say, well, this is from the Q source. And by the way, you can go online, or you can go through the Jesus Seminar or other sources to get an idea of what the Q source would have been like as a document, what was in it and what was contained in it, etc. It's an interesting study to do this. But we would, as New Testament scholars, just say, oh, this is material from the Q source, so it's older than Mark, or at least concurrent with Mark, but it does not come through Peter. Peter's tradition is the Markan tradition. Mark was the disciple of Peter. And so the Gospel of Mark is Petrine tradition. So we'd say, well, this is a non-Petrine tradition of some sort. It's a separate, independent tradition that came through oral tradition and maybe in the second generation was written down. Well, what I'm going to do is read you the Logian first from the Gospel of Thomas, because as we're going to see, this is the oldest and most original version. This is Logian 64. Jesus said, and you have to remember, the Logia in the Gospel of Thomas are not really arranged according to a specific order, whereas Matthew arranges all of his parables in a specific sections. He puts them section by section and certain things he wants to emphasize. And Luke just sort of weaves it into the narrative and finds ways to put it in. So here it is, just as a separate freestanding Logian, 64 in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, and this is a very wonderful way. This is the way Paul introduces things that we don't have from anywhere else, such as it is better to give than to receive, which we get from an epistle of Paul from his received tradition, but it's not in any of the Gospels. And he says, Jesus said, blah, you know. So it says, Jesus said, a man had guest friends. Now, guest friends, we must understand, this is a Semitic term that refers to a Semitic custom. He has, the guest friend tradition is more than I want to go into a lot of detail on, but basically it's a Semitic custom and in which one, to show hospitality, throws a great banquet and invites many people to come. And when he had prepared the dinner, he sent his servant to invite the guest friends. Now, the dinner here is referred to as a deipnon, like the Lord's Supper. It's not referred to as a banquet, like you have the marriage banquet or something. Now the servant went to the first, and he said to him, my master invites thee. And he said, I have some claims against some merchants. They will come to me in the evening. I will go and give them my orders. I pray to be excused from the dinner. And so guest friends are people who are clients of a greater master. And the clientele means they're, in a sense, they sell things to the master and are dependent upon the master for certain things. And so when the master extends them a generous invitation, it's considered to be really quite inexcusable to refuse the invitation. There would have to be some major reason. He went to another and said to him, my master has invited thee. He said to him, I have bought a house, and they request for me for a day. I will have no time. And then he came to another, and he said to him, my master invites me. And he said to him, my friend is to be married, and I am to arrange a dinner. I shall not be able to come. I pray to be excused and from the dinner. And then he went to another, and he said to him, my master invites thee. And he said to him, I have bought a farm. I go to collect the rent. I shall not be able to come. I pray to be excused. You see, each of them has to ask to be excused. And the servant came and said to his master, those whom thou hast invited to the dinner have excused themselves. And the master said to his servant, go out to the roads, bring those whom thou shalt find, so that they may dine. Tradesmen and merchants shall not enter the places of my Father. Now, notice that the people who have excused themselves are all tradesmen and merchants doing economic things. So we have a little section at the very end. It's a kind of little moral at the end of the story here that's saying that tradesmen and merchants shall not enter the places of my Father. Let's for a moment assume that's not necessarily part of the original saying. Now let's see what it looks like in Luke, which I would maintain is it's a little less authentic, but it's a little closer to the original meaning. Now Luke places this in the context of a verse that he puts in when one of those who sat at table with him, Jesus is at dinner eating, one of those who sat at table with him heard this, and what he had heard is that when you give a feast, invite the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. You will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. And so a person who hears this says to him, blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. And now Yeshua in Luke's gospel tells this story in this context. He says, but he, Yeshua, said to him, a man once gave a great banquet and invited many. Now notice the word here is banquet. It's no longer diapnon. It's no longer the same kind of concept as a supper. And at the time for the banquet he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, come, for all is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a field, and I must go out and see it. I pray you, have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. I pray you, have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So the servant came and reported this to his master. Then the householder, in anger, now here we have the appearance of anger, said to his servant, go out quickly to the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in the poor and maimed and blind and lame. Notice that this is parallel to an earlier saying that Jesus said when he's invited to dinner to the man who invited him, when you give a dinner or banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers, your kinsmen or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor and the maimed and the lame, because they can't repay you, and you'll be rewarded in the resurrection of the just. Okay, this is a more authentic kind of an idea. But this man gets angry and tells the servant, go out quickly in the streets and invite the poor and the maimed and the lame, and so on, which were repeated in an earlier Lucan statement. And the servant said, sir, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room. And the master said to the servant, go out to the highways and the byways and the hedges, and compel people to come in, force them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet. Now, this, I think, is possibly a little closer to what Yeshua might have said historically. Notice that the moral at the end of this is not that merchants and traders won't come in to this supper, this dinner, but rather that none of those who were originally invited will come in. And now we're starting to get into the church idea of the Jews who have turned down God's invitation for the Messianic age. Now let's go to Matthew, who goes even further. Now Matthew places this mashal in the context of a whole section of the parables that he's all put together. He likes to group things by order and by what their meaning is, etc. And this is in a group of parables whose general moral is that the Jews are being excluded from their covenant, and the Gentiles being given over to the Gentiles, this type of thing. And in the 22nd chapter, there is no context that this is said in that goes back like Luke does. Remember, Luke is really writing an epistle. It's not really what we think of as a gospel. It's a long story he's telling, and he tells it all in context in terms of the meaning that are being brought out. Well, here Matthew puts these all together. He's taking all kinds of different things that are the same kinds of stories, putting them all together in context, and this is a bunch of stories and parables about the exclusion and, in his interpretation, of not only the Jews, but as we will see, certain Christians, heretics and sectaries and so on, sectarians. So here at the beginning of chapter 22 in Matthew, and again Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to, now all of a sudden we've got a story about the kingdom of heaven, and it's going to be compared to a king who gave a marriage feast for his son. Now we've got a wedding banquet, a marriage banquet, and a very much different custom. entirely different custom than the guest friend custom. And he sent his servants to call those who were invited to the marriage feast. Well, in a true Jewish festival, all the people that were part of this have been invited long ago. And now, by the way, we can see that the Aramaic idioms and customs are best understood in the Gospel of Thomas, the whole business of the guest friends. But we're now talking about a marriage banquet. We're talking about the kingdom of heaven now, who's being invited to the kingdom of heaven. And so this king gave a marriage feast for his son, and he sent his servants to call those who were invited to the marriage feast, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants. So now we've got more servants, different servants being sent out. So this is now a different kind of process. First, the Jewish apostles go out to the Jews, and the Jews don't come. And now the later apostles go out, and some of the people come who are going to be Christians, and others don't come in the right way, or they don't dress right, or something like that. And so we have a second kind of calling and going out. So he sent other servants, saying, "Tell those who were invited, behold, I have made ready my dinner, my oxen, my fat calves are killed, and everything is ready. Come to the marriage feast." But they made light of it and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. My goodness. Now we don't have just merchants who are going to be excluded, who beg to be excused. We have people who are persecuting people, killing them. Okay, this is the experience of the later church. Third generation Gentile Christian church. These people are starting to be persecuted. There are an awful lot of people that really have lost patience with them. In fact, a lot of the early Christian churches were really quite obnoxious in many kinds of ways in how they related to their own communities, and the pogroms that came down against a lot of the early Christians were actually not something that were just instigated by Roman rulers. They were general population hatred of them, sort of like too many Jehovah's Witnesses always showing up at your door. Remember, when Yeshua sent forth his apostles, he said, when you go to a city, go to one house and stay there. And then people who want to hear and learn about this will come to you. He said, do not go door to door. But now we have the Christian evangelism thing where they're starting to push it and going around and pushing people, and the Gentiles are getting their sales techniques down and all this sort of thing, and they're starting to become despised for their attitudes and so on by the general population. And that leads to a lot of the first persecutions of the Christians. So here we have in this parable, they made light of it, one went off, and then he even treated them shamefully and killed them. Now the king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Whoa. So God is coming, and boy, is he mad. Then he said to his servants, the wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Okay, well, who are those invited who were not worthy, whose city was burned down and destroyed? Well, guess what? We're talking about post AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the great city of the Jews. So this is much after that, and this is being blamed upon the refusal of the Jews to accept their own Messiah. God has therefore gone and destroyed their city. So he said, the wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. So go therefore to the thoroughfares and invite to the marriage feast as many as you find, whoever you can find. That's the Gentiles, just anybody out there. And those servants went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But Matthew doesn't stop here. He goes on to say more. He says, but when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there was a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. And the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. There men will weep and gnash their teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. Whoa. Now we have not only the idea that not only the Jews don't get into heaven, but even the Gentiles who don't have the right attitude, or maybe it's the right doctrines or whatever, they don't have the right wedding dress or right wedding garments, will get into the kingdom of heaven. Now this is not what this parable started out being about, it was something a little bit different, wasn't it? Now, we do find that the idioms are best in the Gospel of Thomas. There is the correct Semitic guest friend custom that's used, and the terminology is Semitic terminology. It describes an actual custom that we know about at the time of Yeshua. Now we find the anti-Semitic spin in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew, the idea that the Jews will lose their covenant now and because they haven't responded to the Messianic invitation. And Matthew adds this further early church anti-sectarian content about people not wearing the right garments, and he misunderstands totally the Semitic guest friend custom. And he phrases it not as a guest dinner, which is an entirely different kind of thing, but a marriage banquet, which therefore associates this with something quite different. This is the early Christian Messianic theology about the Messianic banquet. And remember that in the Jewish wedding, the banquet was the last thing in the order of events, and Yeshua celebrated it as a foretaste of a coming Messianic banquet, and that was for those whom he had initiated into the mysteries of the kingdom. But here now the marriage banquet is associated with being a member of the church and coming in and having communion service. And in Matthew's Gospel, if you have the wrong garment, which is allegorically could be the wrong doctrines, or you have the wrong attitude, or you haven't done the right things, you're kicked out. In fact, not just out, but into outer darkness where you will wail and gnash your teeth. You go to hell. And this is an anti-sectarian spin within the early churches. And we find in the early churches, even at the time of Paul, a lot of dissension between different forms of churches and different cultic leaders. In fact, by the time we get the Apocalypse of John, we have all these things being said about the different, church at Ephesus and the church at this place and church at that place, and what's wrong with them, and they're too hot, too cold, whatever this stuff is. So now we're getting really pretty late into the early church history, where the early churches are now competing with each other, just like the Protestants all split apart over one word in their creed and things like this. So what's historical? Well, it seems that what we see in the Gospel of Thomas is really probably the earliest phrasing of this, although we do see a little conclusion added to it that says that merchants and these kinds of people will not be invited to the supper. But we also have the Lucan association of this with the idea that you should give to the poor instead of why don't do good deeds only to those who do good deeds to you, but do good deeds to those who have not yet who are not able to give back to you, and that way you're carrying on a Eucharistic lifestyle. That's a pretty original teaching of Yeshua as well. So at least in Matthew and Luke we have some pretty early stuff. So I would suggest that what we have here is a parable about the refusal of the temple establishment to accept the Messianic invitation. This is not the refusal of the Jews, and it's certainly not refusal of other sects. It's a refusal of the temple establishment in Jerusalem to accept the Messianic invitation, and therefore the invitation goes out to whom? It goes out to the Am Haaretz, the people of the land, the common Jews, the people who are considered not to be religious Jews, the outsiders, the one who the religious Pharisees and Sadducees think are going to go to hell, and all this sort of thing. And this is indeed what Yeshua did. He brought his message and his grace to the common people. And he had much criticism to say about the temple establishment and the wealthy merchants and traders who control the temple and the religious establishment. So in the Gospel of Thomas, the little saying about merchants and other people will not go into my supper, this is not too unlike what we recall about his criticism of the temple. As it had become a commercial house of merchants, rather than a house of prayer, and when he overturned all the stalls of the merchants and let the birds go free and all this sort of thing. So we really have a situation where Thomas is giving us the most authentic version, and that predates the Q source. Even the Q source, which we get in its most untarnished form probably in Luke, and Luke is a very good and early gospel, is not the earliest form. So when you interpret this and you look for the original teaching of Jesus in the context of what was happening at his time, it is not a good idea to extend this and make this into an anti-Semitic parable, as has been done in the Gospels. It is not a good idea to extend it and make it into something that excludes the Baptists or the Lutherans or other kinds of things, as has been done by implication in the Gospels. Rather, it's a good idea to just get the basic idea of what Yeshua was saying. He was saying an invitation has been offered. The time has come. The season has arrived. The 5,000-year period has come, and now we are in the period where God's grace is offered. And yet those who should be receiving it, those who are the custodians of the spiritual tradition of the Jews, they are not worthy of it. Why? Because they will not accept it. They don't recognize it. So, therefore, it goes to the non-religious. So what the issue here is, then, not of Jews versus Gentiles, although this makes an opening for Gentiles, the issue here is of establishment versus non-establishment, or of the wealthy versus the poor, or of the self-proclaimed religious versus the humble. So this is what we're talking about. Now, this is something you can apply to the modern world. There are lots and lots of people who feel very dispossessed by religion. There are people in prisons. There are people on the street. There are many, many people that just don't relate to the kind of religion that is offered through fundamentalist churches or institutional churches or anything else. And does that mean they're excluded from all this? No, no, no. As a matter of fact, it may mean something very much different. How are the custodians of our religious institutions really reacting to the kinds of issues that are what we would call messianic issues? And that is something to think about and discuss. Now let's take a look at another exegetical example. This is the parable of the 10 virgins and the marriage banquet. And this is a parable about a marriage banquet and the customs that existed. However, we find this only in Matthew's Gospel, in the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. It actually in the same kind of section of parables that we were looking at before that show who's going to be excluded and why. And so this is just the special Matthean material. We don't have this in the Gospel of Thomas or anything else. It only appears in Matthew. So that does not mean that it's inauthentic. That simply means we have to recognize it only appears in Matthew, and we're up to we're pretty much on to Matthew's game now. We've seen how he takes things and how he takes the issues of his church time and uses them to interpret and twist and make things into something that makes sense to him. So let's read the story. The story goes like this. The kingdom of heaven shall be compared to 10 maidens. Okay, now it's another kingdom of heaven story. This is Yeshua comparing this to the kingdom of heaven. Now, we wonder about this because the last time we looked at the supper, the guest friend supper, which is not by any means in the original saying a wedding banquet by any means. It's an entirely different custom, but this is interpreted again as a kingdom of heaven parable. So he says the kingdom of heaven shall be compared to 10 maidens, and the word is virgins is what is translated in the King James, but the word really means maiden. It means an unmarried woman. It has nothing to do with the state of her hymen. It has to do with unmarried women. And they're going to be actually bridesmaids at the wedding, they would be. The kingdom of heaven shall be compared to 10 maidens, that should really be bridesmaids, who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. Now, if you recall the custom, the bridegroom comes at midnight, or he comes late in the middle of the night in order to go through a sort of symbolic kidnapping of the bride and taking her to the place where they will have intimacy for 7 days, and it will be guarded by the bridegroom's best friend, and then the proof of her virginity will be given, and then the marriage banquet will be given at the end of all that to celebrate the consummation of the marriage. So here he says there's 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom, and that's when they're doing it, midnight. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. Okay. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. Now as the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Well, wait a minute. The bridegroom wasn't delayed where people all slumber and sleep. They expect him to come out about midnight. So he wasn't delayed. He was coming at the right time. But Matthew turns this into a delay of the parousia, a delay of the second coming. The bridegroom is, of course, Jesus, and he's being delayed. So he's comparing this now to the second coming of Christ. The second coming is the coming of Christ in victory, when the church, which is the bride of Christ, and Christ meet together in the great marriage of heaven and earth. So he has this little line about as the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Now there is a lot of parables that we find in Matthew, and that they're interpreted that you don't know the time and the place, and when you least expect it, just like those in Noah's flood, the second coming will occur, and some will be taken into heaven. It'll be like the rapture, and others will be left behind, and all sort of thing. This is the kind of stuff you find in Matthew's gospel really emphasized. So here at midnight comes the bridegroom. So, and then it says, "Behold, the bridegroom come out to meet him." And then all those maidens rose and trimmed their lamps. That's what you do, is a little pottery lamp that has oil in it and a wick. And you trim the wick so it's just the right height, and then light the wick. And the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." They didn't have the proper oil. They didn't have the right amount. But the wise replied, "Perhaps there will not be enough for us and for you. Go rather to the dealers and buy for yourself." Well, I really don't think there are going to be any shops open at midnight. And while they went to buy, which doesn't make any sense at all, because nobody was open at midnight, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other bridesmaids came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly I say to you, I do not know you." Where have we heard this before? Well, just look at a couple of other parables. They end the very same way, the same moral. You didn't do something right. You didn't wear the right wedding garment. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. I don't know you. You are out. You are gone. And now Matthew attaches a little moral to it, which is actually a very different kind of saying. It's probably a totally separate logion that doesn't connect with this. "Therefore I say to you, truly I say to you, I do not know you." And then the little moral, it says, "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. For it will be as when a man going on a journey called his servants." And then he tells another story that gives you the same thing, that any time the Lord can return. So you see, this business about the returning of the Lord is actually comes out of Yeshua's teaching about the coming of the Messiah. But now it's the second coming of Jesus as the Messiah, and it's the second coming will come any minute. The first generations of Gentile Christians expected it any day, not necessarily because of anything that Yeshua taught, but because that's what the public was primed for. There were these apocalyptic ideas floating around in the Hellenistic world, the Greek world, and in certain Jewish sections and so on. But we don't really find Yeshua teaching quite this way. He simply says, You don't know the time and you don't know the place, but in Yeshua's teaching, it could be thousands of years away. But in this teaching, it's immediate. At any moment, at any time, this can occur. So Matthew is a big proponent of this. So that's what we see in Matthew. Now, first we want to recover the Aramaic and the conventions and things like this. And the first thing we see is that the virgins or the maidens are the bridesmaids. That would be the custom. And the bridesmaids actually wait with the bride and tend to the bride. And also the custom for the marriage thing is not that the groom comes and grabs the bride and then they all go and have a banquet. No. And there's no door that's shut. In fact, if there was a door that's shut, it's going to be the door to the place where the groom and the bride have their honeymoon for 7 days, and that's going to be guarded. Nobody goes in there to participate in that. So this does not know what the Jewish wedding custom was. It's completely divorced from that. It's now made a bunch of assumptions about the kingdom of God as the messianic banquet, but it doesn't even know what the order of events is or how Yeshua would have interpreted it. So the concept of Malkuth, the concept of divine sovereignty, is totally twisted here. It's just twisted into the concept we know as the Basileia, the kingdom, the king domain of God, the Noah's Ark that you can come into or not come into. Where in Yeshua's teaching, the sovereignty of God is everywhere. It's invisible, you can't see it, you don't know it, and it's within you. It's entos humon. It's there all the time. It's not something that anything can be excluded from. And the bridesmaid is not a virgin. The bridesmaid has a very specific function, and she doesn't go waiting outside. She's going to accompany the procession. The bridesmaids are going to accompany the procession with lamps and lights, and it's going to be a procession from the bride's home to the place that's been prepared by the groom and other men that are his friends and so on. But it's not going to be a procession that leads directly to a banquet. So now you want to check critically for this meaning in the context of known Palestinian customs, and we know these customs, and we know that Matthew's gospel just doesn't have a clue. It's something entirely different. So let's look at what seems to be the Semitic and the possibly authentic part that would be possibly a parable spoken by Yeshua. It probably ended originally with the midnight arrival of the bridegroom, because there's nothing else after that except this dogmatic stuff about people being excluded. And that is not something we find when we analyze parables. We don't find that as the exclusionary clause as something that is original with Yeshua. That comes later in the churches. So it probably ended somewhere around this thing about the midnight arrival of the bridegroom, which and probably had the meaning of these people are not prepared. They haven't done their homework. They haven't prepared their souls, because discipleship was a preparation for the Messianic age. And if you didn't do your work on yourself, then you'll be unprepared for the Messianic age. And so the worst kind of discipline or punishment they would ever get is they wouldn't be able to participate in the procession. They would not be excluded from a Noah's Ark door or something. And Yeshua's meaning, then, if it's authentic, would be something like that. That it had to do with the preparation of discipleship that has to be done to prepare your lamp with oil. If you are going to be a bridesmaid, you're going to be one who assists the bride, and the bride represents humanity, the marriage of humanity to divinity. Now there's a non-Semitic and inauthentic part. The whole business of the wedding feast. The wedding feast comes after the honeymoon. It's not something that comes first. And the meaning to the redactors of Matthew was quite different. It was one of his good old famous exclusion parables where he says, if you're not ready, if you don't wear the right kind of garment, if you don't have the right kind of doctrine, if you're not a member of the right church, you're going to go to hell when you die. You're going to be excluded from the kingdom, this sort of thing. So Matthew's usual spin is what we're getting here, the exclusion of sectarians, of other Christians, not just of the Jews. He not only excludes the Jews, he excludes other Christians, and he's probably talking about certain kinds of Hellenistic Gnostic Christians and people whose views differ from